Sources within the royal household confirm that the future king unilaterally inserted a one-person rule into the coronation protocol planning, effectively banning his stepmother from Westminster Abbey and thwarting a scheme to embed her son Tom Parker Bowles into the palace's logistics operations. This power struggle between the two royal offices has shattered the veneer of harmony surrounding the reign of Charles III, plunging the relationship between stepmother and stepson into an irreversible, winner-takes-all confrontation. The directive, colloquially referred to inside the walls of Kensington Palace as the single sovereign rule, is not merely a bureaucratic adjustment, it is a calculated, permanent eviction. The mandate dictates that the next coronation will strip away the dual monarch imagery that characterized the 2023 ceremony. Instead, the focus will be compressed exclusively onto the new king, his queen consort, Catherine, and their immediate heirs, Princes George and Louis, and Princess Charlotte. Under this newly codified framework, Queen Camilla is granted no official invitation, no designated ceremonial function, no symbolic role within the liturgy, and crucially, no access to the historic theatre of Westminster Abbey or the iconic balcony of Buckingham Palace. This drastic measure is the culmination of a bitter, behind-the-scenes war of attrition that reached its absolute nadir during the first half of 2026. For months, the respective private offices of the Prince of Wales and the Queen Consort have engaged in an increasingly hostile briefing war, with lines of communication deteriorating into formal, cold memoranda. While public appearances maintained a veneer of institutional cohesion, the internal machinery of the monarchy was gridlocked by a profound struggle over the boundaries of domestic and ceremonial authority. The flashpoint that transformed this simmering resentment into an overt institutional blockade occurred during a closed-door, highly classified rehearsal at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, an event that insiders now mark as the moment the domestic truce was permanently shattered. The rehearsal, intended to finalize the procession mechanics and formal seating orders for an upcoming national service, was meant to be a routine exercise overseen by ceremonial staff. However, witnesses report that Queen Camilla initiated a unilateral restructuring of the approved protocol. Citing historical precedents of seniority, Camilla directed palace attendants to alter the spatial arrangement of the chairs, effectively moving Princess Charlotte and her mother, the Princess of Wales, several paces behind members of her own maternal lineage. The visual implication was stark. It subtly subordinated the direct line of the House of Windsor to the extended family of the Parker Bowles circle. The confrontation that followed was instantaneous and devoid of typical royal euphemism. Upon entering the chapel and witnessing an attendant physically removing Princess Charlotte's place card from the front row, Prince William bypassed the intervening court officials. Without elevating his voice, he crossed the stone floor of the choir stalls, intercepted the attendant, and personally returned his daughter's marker to its original position of direct precedence. When confronted by Camilla near the historic stalls, the Prince of Wales maintained an icy composure, flatly rejecting the assertion that the king's current household possessed the authority to manipulate the ceremonial hierarchy of his immediate family. The interaction, witnessed by a handful of stunned senior advisors, marked the end of any remaining diplomatic pretense between the heir apparent and his stepmother. Unknown to the wider household at Clarence House, the chapel incident was not treated by William as an isolated disagreement over etiquette, but rather as an overt breach of a long-established domestic border. In the days following the Windsor confrontation, the Prince of Wales initiated a highly restricted clandestine operation within his own private office. He ordered the creation of what has since been termed the sealed folder, a meticulous, documented log cataloging every instance over the past several years in which Queen Camilla's office had attempted to alter, restrict, or interfere with the public duties, logistical support, and ceremonial access of Catherine and the children. This dossier was compiled with clinical precision, far removed from emotional impulse, serving as a legalistic foundation for the eventual exclusion decree. Armed with this definitive log of institutional overreach, William chose a neutral sitting room at Clarence House to deliver his ultimatum directly to Camilla, bypasses any mitigating presence of private secretaries. It was during this intense, face-to-face showdown that the Prince of Wales delivered the definitive blow to Camilla's historical anxieties about her legacy, looking her directly in the eyes to state, "You will not stand beside me while I take the oath." This statement struck at the very core of Camilla's decades-long campaign for institutional legitimacy. For a woman who had endured a lifetime of public scrutiny, intense media hostility, and relentless comparisons to the late Diana, Princess of Wales, to secure her place beside Charles, this absolute exclusion from the future coronation represents the ultimate undoing of her life's work. By anchoring his decision strictly to her recent maneuvers rather than historical grievances, William effectively insulated his mandate from accusations of simple childhood revenge, framing it instead as a necessary act of constitutional defense. As this administrative curtain falls around the Queen Consort, the systemic nature of William's campaign has become undeniable. The planning documents now embedded within the state machinery ensure that the exclusion cannot be reversed by mere domestic pleading or a sudden shift in family dynamics. It stands as a cold, administrative reality, the first irreversible exercise of sovereign authority by a Prince of Wales, who has chosen to define his future reign not by the messy compromises of his father's past, but by an unyielding, modern discipline that starts within his own walls. The reported exclusion of Tom Parker Bowles from the inner royal circle and the resulting palace friction are detailed in this Royal Ascot controversy video, which examines the growing divide and tactical maneuvers within the House of Windsor. To fully comprehend the depth of Prince William's clinical execution of the exclusion order, one must examine the broader, multi-layered strategy that Queen Camilla had deployed to secure a permanent footprint for her own bloodline within the ancient infrastructure of the British monarchy. This was not a conflict confined to seating charts at Windsor. It was a systemic battle for influence, logistics, and domestic control that reached deep into the very heart of the royal palaces. At the center of this flanking maneuver was Camilla's son, Thomas Parker Bowles, a well-established culinary critic and author whose public and private endeavors became the primary vehicle for what the Prince of Wales viewed as a calculated infiltration of the royal household. The ground for this domestic incursion was systematically prepared over several years. Late in the year 2024, Thomas Parker Bowles released a high-profile, semi-official culinary book titled Cooking and the Crown. On the surface, the publication was presented to the public as a benign, historical celebration of royal gastronomy, meticulously detailing the dining habits of British sovereigns, spanning from the grand banquets of Queen Victoria to the deeply personal, daily preferences of King Charles III. It even included intimate domestic details, such as the specific morning oatmeal preparations favored by Queen Camilla. However, beneath the glossy pages of historical recipes lay a highly sophisticated public relations campaign designed to blur the lines between legitimate royal lineage and the extended Parker Bowles family. By the time the calendar turned to the year 2026, this media campaign had transitioned into an overt physical presence. Throughout the spring and into the summer, Thomas Parker Bowles was repeatedly positioned at the center of high-profile royal events, appearing with unprecedented frequency alongside his mother. The apex of this public integration occurred in the middle of June in the year 2026, during the prestigious Royal Ascot Festival. Observers noted that Thomas was not merely a passive guest in the royal enclosure, he was actively presented as an institutional insider, utilizing his newfound status as the chronicler of the royal palate to command the attention of court officials, international dignitaries, and the aristocracy. Behind the closed doors of Clarence House and Buckingham Palace, however, a far more ambitious plot was taking shape under Camilla's direct patronage. The Queen Consort sought to leverage her son's culinary credentials to institute a sweeping reorganization of the royal household's catering and procurement departments. The strategic objective was clear. By embedding Thomas Parker Bowles as an official consultant or director overseeing the sprawling logistical network of the palace kitchens, the supply chains, and the grand state banquets, the Parker Bowles family would achieve a permanent, institutionalized foothold within the daily operations of the monarchy. This move would have effectively normalized their presence, granting them unrestricted access to the private quarters and secure zones of the sovereign's residences. This subtle bid for domestic control did not escape the vigilant oversight of the Prince of Wales. William, who had long maintained a policy of absolute separation between the official funding of the House of Windsor and the private families of non-royal spouses, viewed this culinary maneuver as an intolerable breach of security and institutional integrity. The future king recognized that allowing the Parker Bowles clan to control the internal hospitality apparatus would create an alternative center of influence within the palace walls, one that owed its loyalty entirely to Camilla, rather than the direct line of succession. William's response was swift, definitive, and devastating. Utilizing his considerable authority over the Duchy of Cornwall and his expanding administrative oversight of the royal estates, the Prince of Wales instituted a total, uncompromising ban on Thomas Parker Bowles. William flatly rejected every proposal brought forward by Camilla's office to introduce her son into the palace management structure, ordering senior court officials to terminate any discussions regarding Thomas's involvement in the royal kitchens. The directive was absolute. Thomas Parker Bowles was declared an institutional outsider, permanently barred from participating in any official capacity within the sovereign's household. This administrative blockade extended far beyond professional rejection. It manifested as an unyielding social exile from the core family gatherings that define the inner sanctum of the monarchy. In a series of remarkably candid admissions that were later recontextualized by palace insiders as evidence of this bitter internal warfare, Thomas Parker Bowles himself was forced to acknowledge the rigid boundaries of his exclusion. He admitted to associates and media contacts that despite his mother's elevated status as queen consort, he and his immediate family had never once been extended an invitation to join the core royal family for their traditional Christmas celebrations or the exclusive, highly restricted private dinners at Sandringham House. Instead, the reality of their marginalized status was laid bare. Thomas and his siblings were permitted to see their mother only on the 27th of December. Long after the official family gatherings had concluded, the senior royals had departed, and the sacred, historic environment of Sandringham had transitioned back to a private residence. This arrangement was not accidental. It was the direct result of a strict protocol enforced by Prince William to ensure that the core symbolic spaces of the monarchy remained entirely insulated from those he considered marital appendages rather than true dynastic heirs. The message transmitted from Kensington Palace was devoid of ambiguity or diplomatic softness. William communicated through his senior staff that individuals who entered the royal orbit solely through marriage did not possess an inherent right to alter the fabric or the traditions of the House of Windsor. The Prince of Wales reportedly summarized his position with a chilling clarity that reverberated through the corridors of the palace, stating that they were merely individuals who had married in, not members of the true sovereign line, and that the palace had absolutely no room for the ambitions of the Parker Bowles family. This decisive counteroffensive not only dismantled Camilla's immediate plans for her son, but also signaled to the entire court that the future king was fully prepared to purge the institution of any elements that threatened the absolute primacy of his own direct household. The administrative guillotine dropped by the Prince of Wales did not merely sever the ambitions of the Parker Bowles family. It plunged King Charles III into the most agonizing personal and constitutional dilemma of his entire reign. By the time the sun began to set over London following William's decisive meeting with his senior advisors, the signed exclusion order had been officially delivered to the king's private study at Windsor Castle. The speed of the administrative rollout left the monarch completely isolated, caught between the unyielding duty he owed to the future of the crown and the deep, personal loyalty he felt toward the woman who had stood by his side through decades of global scandal and domestic turmoil. Queen Camilla had entered the king's private quarters fully expecting her husband to exercise his sovereign prerogative and immediately veto William's aggressive planning framework. Instead, she was met with the sight of a broken, silent monarch who had already realized that his authority was rapidly slipping into the hands of his heir. Charles had read the dossier compiled in the sealed folder twice, recognizing that his son had built an airtight case based on documented instances of interference rather than emotional outbursts. The king understood that if he chose to challenge William openly, it would trigger an unprecedented constitutional crisis over the limits of royal authority, publicly exposing a fractured monarchy to a nation already questioning its future. The confrontation within the king's study reached an unbearable emotional peak when Camilla placed the formal exclusion notice directly onto Charles's desk, demanding to know if he intended to defend her position as his queen. When the king remained seated, his silence stretching out into the quiet room, Camilla performed a gesture of profound symbolic resignation. She unpinned the historic diamond brooch from her dress, laid it flat upon the mahogany desk between them, and told the monarch that his silence was also a choice. She then walked out of the study, leaving the king alone with the glittering emblem of a broken promise. Later that evening, Charles summoned William to a highly restricted meeting at Windsor Castle. ensuring that all private secretaries, ladies-in-waiting, and even the Princess of Wales were entirely absent from the room. The king sought to determine if any path toward domestic reconciliation remained open. He questioned his son as to whether this total ban was truly a matter of national security or simply a delayed punishment for the deep psychological wounds inflicted upon the family during the tragic breakdown of his marriage to Diana, Princess of Wales. William stood firm, refusing to allow his father to reduce a grave matter of state to mere childhood resentment. The prince explained with clinical clarity that this was about the current preservation of the monarchy. He stated that Camilla's aggressive maneuvers to displace Princess Charlotte and alter the duties of Catherine proved she did not respect the boundaries of the future household. Although William's demeanor softened out of respect for his father's visible physical frailty, his constitutional resolve did not waver. He assured the king that Camilla would retain the domestic comforts and respect owed to the spouse of a reigning monarch, but she would never be permitted to pollute the sacred ritual that would define the start of his own sovereign rule. Charles finally bowed his head, accepting the reality that the true power within the palace had already shifted to his son. While the tempest raged through the ancient corridors of Windsor Castle and Clarence House, a far more profound and analytical conversation was taking place within the quiet confines of Adelaide Cottage. Here, away from the immediate gaze of courtiers and the frantic whisperings of the household staff, Prince William stood by a tall window, looking out over the private gardens as the reality of his monumental decision began to settle over his shoulders. Behind him, observing his tense posture with an innate understanding of the historical burden he carried, was Catherine, Princess of Wales. In this quiet domestic arena, the true ideological framework of the future reign was being forged, not through anger, but through a shared commitment to the long-term survival of the institution. Catherine's role in this unfolding dynastic drama was neither that of a passive bystander nor an aggressive instigator of revenge. Despite the pervasive and highly sensationalized narratives spun by external commentators, the Princess of Wales did not harbor a desire for personal retribution regarding the historical injustices suffered by the late Diana, Princess of Wales. Catherine viewed the monarchy through a lens of strict professionalism and institutional duty, recognizing that allowing personal grievances to dictate the grand strategy of the state would ultimately cheapen the very crown her husband was destined to wear. Her restraint throughout the escalating crisis had served as William's anchor, providing him with a calm, intellectual sanctuary when the domestic pressures threatened to cloud his judgment. During this private conference, Catherine quietly questioned her husband, asking if he was entirely certain that the total exclusion of the queen consort was the correct path forward, warning that such a definitive strike would inflict a deep, unhealable wound upon his father. William turned to his wife and insisted that this decision had transcended the painful ghosts of the past, explaining that it was no longer merely about the memory of his mother. He detailed how Camilla's recent maneuvers had directly targeted the strategic positioning of Catherine herself and the ceremonial roles of their three children, Princes George and Louis and Princess Charlotte. For William, the moment his stepmother attempted to manipulate the public standing and precedence of his immediate family was the moment she transitioned from a difficult domestic relative into an active threat to the future stability of the throne. Catherine listened with a grave solemnity, recognizing the validity of his strategic assessment. She understood that a monarchy could not survive if its core line of succession allowed itself to be marginalized by a secondary, marital branch of the family. While she urged William to ensure that old pain did not entirely dictate his actions, she ultimately validated his right and his duty to protect the integrity of his future reign. She did not demand the public destruction of Camilla, but she stood firmly beside her husband in his determination to establish an unyielding boundary around their household, agreeing that a false display of family unity at the next coronation would do catastrophic damage to public trust from the very first day of his rule. With the absolute backing of his wife, William's resolve was completely hardened. He recognized that Catherine's support was not driven by a petty desire for court dominance, but by a maternal and institutional protective instinct that matched his own. This shared understanding allowed the Prince of Wales to return to his office and sign the final, revised planning directives with a steady hand, secure in the knowledge that his immediate household was completely unified in its vision for a streamlined, highly disciplined monarchy that would broker no internal rivalries or systemic interference from those who had merely married into the historic House of Windsor. By the following morning, the administrative fortress that Prince William had constructed around his decision collapsed under the weight of an unprecedented media disclosure. The highly classified protocols embedded within the official planning framework were leaked to the public, triggering a seismic wave that rippled across the capital and instantly dominated the global consciousness. Broadcasters abandoned their carefully scheduled programming, and newspaper presses throughout the United Kingdom rushed to publish extraordinary special editions. The private border that the Prince of Wales had drawn within the quiet rooms of Kensington Palace had suddenly become a public earthquake, exposing the deep, unhealed historical fractures of the British electorate. The media coverage was immediate and highly polarized, reflecting a nation caught between a desire for modern institutional reform and a lingering sympathy for traditional stability. A major national broadcaster broke the story during its flagship early morning program, describing the absolute exclusion of Queen Camilla as William's clean break with the previous royal household. The presenter emphasized to millions of viewers that the Queen consort would hold no ceremonial role, would receive no official invitation, and would be entirely absent from Westminster Abbey during the next coronation. Within minutes, a prominent national newspaper hit the streets with a stark, dramatic front page featuring a photograph of the Prince of Wales walking ahead alone beneath a bold, uncompromising headline that read, "His crown, his rules." Beside this powerful image sat a smaller, contrasting photograph of the Queen consort leaving a private church service, turning an internal administrative decree into a definitive public symbol of permanent separation. As the morning progressed, large crowds began to materialize outside the gates of Buckingham Palace and the historic exterior of Clarence House. The atmosphere on the streets was charged with intense debate, revealing that the public viewed this institutional conflict through the lens of their own deeply held loyalties. Some individuals carried faded photographs of the late Diana, Princess of Wales, viewing William's decisive action as a brave, long overdue act of filial justice and a necessary purification of the royal lineage. Conversely, other groups of citizens argued fiercely that excluding an elderly royal woman, who had dedicated over 2 decades of loyal service to the reigning king, was an act of needless cruelty that would embarrass the nation on the global stage. The unfolding debate made it clear that Britain was still actively judging the present reality of the monarchy through the emotional wounds of a past generation that had never truly closed. Inside the private sitting room at Clarence House, the reality of this public spectacle crashed down upon Queen Camilla with a devastating weight. Sitting with only a single, trusted private secretary by her side, she watched the continuous television coverage as reporters dissected her marginalization. When the presenter repeated the stark declaration that she had been barred from the supreme ritual of the state, Camilla reached for the remote control, switched off the screen, and remarked quietly to her aide that the harsh wording made her sound like a common criminal. Her decades of careful image rehabilitation, her patient endurance of public hostility, and her meticulous efforts to secure a respectable place within the history of the realm had been dismantled in a single media cycle, leaving her profoundly isolated within the very institution she had fought so desperately to legitimize. Prince William, observing the rapid escalation from his office at Kensington Palace, was deeply disturbed by how quickly the story had transformed into a humiliating public spectacle. He had intended his mandate to be a cold administrative defense of his future reign, not a piece of public entertainment. The prince immediately ordered his communications team to maintain an absolute, ironclad silence, forbidding them from releasing any personal accusations or utilizing any language that could be interpreted as triumphant. Catherine, Princess of Wales, reading the sensationalized newspaper coverage by his side, issued a stern warning to her husband, reminding him that public approval could quickly become dangerous if the citizenry began to treat the intense suffering of their family as a form of national circus. She emphasized that true sovereign strength would now be measured by their total restraint, not by how loudly the external crowds cheered for the downfall of his stepmother. In an effort to stabilize the collapsing public relations narrative, King Charles III approved a brief, highly formal statement from the Palace Communications Department. The carefully worded release confirmed that the future sovereign would retain total, independent control over his own coronation arrangements. By explicitly utilizing the term sovereign, the wording made it undeniably clear to the public and the political establishment that William's constitutional authority over the future ceremony would not be challenged by the current occupant of the throne. The statement offered no defense of Camilla and levied no condemnation against William. It was a public acknowledgement of a total systemic surrender, signaling to the entire world that the transition of true power within the House of Windsor was already absolute and irreversible. When the formal letter from Prince William arrived, delivered by a senior courier from the Duchy of Cornwall, there were no legal advisors present to draft a calculated rebuttal, and no path left for political maneuvering. The document was respectful in its tone, explicitly acknowledging her years of devotion to King Charles III, but it remained entirely unyielding in its core substance. The Prince of Wales did not offer a compromise or an opening for future dialogue. He merely laid out the final reality of the streamlined monarchy he had chosen to build. Camilla read the letter twice, her eyes pausing on the definitive passage confirming that the future coronation would focus exclusively on the incoming sovereign, his consort, and the direct heirs in the line of succession. In that moment, her anger faded into a profound, historical sadness. She understood that her campaign for permanent dynastic legitimacy had reached its absolute end. No intervention from the king could reverse this administrative reality. She took up her pen and composed a brief, definitive reply to Kensington Palace, stating clearly that she accepted William's constitutional authority over his future ceremony and would not challenge the protocols publicly. Her household was ordered to cease all attempts to influence the royal hierarchy, bringing an end to the strategic maneuvers that had begun in the choir stalls of St. George's Chapel. When the notification of her surrender reached Prince William, he felt no sense of petty triumph or personal celebration. The future king understood that protecting the long-term survival of the crown had required the cold execution of a strategy that had deeply wounded his father and shattered the remaining bonds of trust within the family. Yet, as Catherine quietly reminded him during their final briefing on the matter, the coronation could not be remembered by history merely as the day a stepmother was rejected. It had to be understood as the day a new sovereign family fully accepted the immense burden of public service without the distractions of past rivalries. Her words shifted the meaning of the entire conflict from a narrative of personal punishment to one of institutional purpose. The final parameters of the internal settlement left Queen Camilla with her official titles, her royal residences, and her public dignity intact during the lifetime of King Charles III. However, her authority over the wider operations of the royal households was completely dismantled, and her family's grand ambitions for institutional integration were permanently crushed. Thomas Parker Bowles remained outside the secure perimeter of the palace kitchens, his culinary aspirations restricted to the commercial world, far removed from the official logistics of the state. The line of succession had reasserted its absolute primacy over the House of Windsor. Ultimately, this bitter conflict was not a simple dispute over seating cards or a delayed manifestation of childhood grief regarding the late Diana, Princess of Wales. It was William's definitive declaration of independence, a formal notification to the court and the country that his future reign would not inherit the chaotic compromises, the domestic silences, and the overlapping rivalries of his father's past. King Charles III accepted that he could not control the future of the throne he occupied. Queen Camilla accepted that her sacrifice did not guarantee permanent institutional influence, and Prince William accepted that true sovereign leadership often demanded the infliction of profound personal pain without the reward of an easy victory. With the planning framework permanently codified, the future king turned his gaze toward the horizon, having executed the first irreversible decision of his destiny.